The diner had been sitting on Route 93 for 41 years. Rosie's hand-painted letters on a pine board faded by Nevada sun until the paint had gone the color of old bones. The parking lot was cracked asphalt and loose gravel in a single light pole that buzzed when the temperature dropped below 40. There were 6 stools at the counter and 8 booths along the window wall and a jukebox in the corner that still worked if you kicked it twice on the left side. The coffee was strong because Edna Walsh believed weak coffee was a moral failing. The pie was good because everything Edna did was good. That was just the nature of the woman. It was 2:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in November when the motorcycle pulled off the highway. Sarah Briggs heard it before she saw it. She was refilling the napkin holders at the far end of the counter, and the sound came through the plate glass, first low and steady, the kind of engine that had been running a long time and wasn't apologizing for it. She straightened up and looked through the window. One headlight cutting through the dark. A big man on a big bike moving slow, pulling into the lot like he owned the night and was just deciding where to park it. She watched him kill the engine, watched him sit for a moment without moving the way men do when they have been on the road so long that stopping feels like a foreign country. Then he pulled off his helmet and hung it on the handlebar and climbed off with the careful deliberateness of a body that had been carrying itself through hard country for too many years. 6'2", maybe 230 pounds, a leather vest over a dark flannel shirt, the vest worn in the way things get worn when they have been part of a person's daily life for decades. Gray at the temples, a face that looked like it had been weathered by wind and decision rather than by time alone. He walked toward the door with his hands at his sides and his eyes moving the way eyes move when they are looking at everything and committing none of it to expression. Sarah had worked the night shift at Rosie's for 11 years. She knew how to read a man walking through that door at 2 in the morning. This one was not drunk, was not running from something immediate. He was tired in the deep way, the way that sleep does not fix the way that only miles accumulate, and miles alone can sometimes metabolize. She picked up a coffee mug before he had cleared the threshold. He sat at the far end of the counter, back to the wall, eyes on the door. She set the mug in front of him and poured. He looked at the coffee, then he looked at her, and for just a moment she had the odd sensation that he was checking something against some internal record, the way people do when a face reminds them of something they cannot quite place. She held his gaze. She had learned long ago not to look away first. He nodded once, looked at the menu board on the wall above the grill window. Steak, she said. Medium, fries, that is what most people want at this hour. He did not answer, but he did not correct her either. She wrote it down and clipped it to the wheel in the window and spun it. Carl was back there. She heard him pull the ticket, heard the grill fire up. She went back to the napkin holders and let the man drink his coffee in peace. The diner was empty except for the 3 of them. Edna Walsh was at the far end of the counter sorting receipts, the way she sorted receipts every Tuesday night, which meant stacking them in 3 piles and then restacking them in the same 3 piles and making small sounds of displeasure at numbers that displeased her. She was 79 years old, and she had opened this diner when she was 38, and in 41 years she had never once closed it for a holiday. She had a face that was all structure, high cheekbones and clear gray eyes, and a jaw that said she had made her decisions a long time ago and was not interested in revisiting them. Her white hair was pinned back. Her hands were quick. She did not look up from the receipts. Sarah came back to refill the man's coffee at the 10-minute mark. He had his hands around the mug and his eyes on the parking lot through the window. Not watching it exactly, more like keeping an eye on it, the way you keep an eye on a road that has never given you trouble, but that you have learned through long experience can change its character without warning. She understood that kind of watching. She had been doing it herself for 3 years. The ticket wheel spun. Carl's voice came through the window low and flat. Order up. Sarah went to the window, took the plate. Steak, medium fries, side of toast she had not ordered, but that Carl put on anyway the way he sometimes did, and she had never been able to decide if that was generosity or something else. The plate was heavy in her hands. She walked the length of the counter. She set the plate in front of the man, and then she did not let go of it. Her left hand stayed on the rim of the plate, fingers pressed flat against the ceramic edge, and she stood there with the plate between them and said 4 words. Don't touch that plate, not loud, not shaking. The way you say something when you have decided and the decision is already past the point where emotion is relevant. The man looked up. He had pale gray eyes, and they were very still, the way still water is, still holding everything below the surface and giving away nothing. He looked at her hand on the plate. Then he looked at her face. He did not look angry. He did not look confused. He looked like a man who had learned a long time ago to pay attention to the thing that did not fit. What he said. I watched him, she said quietly. The cook. He came out from the back 2 minutes before he plated this. He had something in his left hand from his apron pocket. He stood with his back to the window while he plated it. The man did not move. She held his gaze. Her heart was going at a speed she was not going to let show on her face. You sure about what you saw? He said. It was not a question in the way most questions are. It was closer to the thing a man says when he is already deciding to believe you and just wants to hear you say it once more. I have been watching that window for 11 years, she said. I know what it looks like when Carl plates a steak. That was not it. Edna had not looked up from the receipts, but her hands had stopped moving. The man looked at the plate. He looked at the kitchen door. Then he looked at Sarah with an expression that was not gratitude exactly and not assessment exactly, but something that sat between the two, the look of a person recalibrating. He stood up. He was bigger standing than he had looked sitting down. He moved toward the kitchen door with the unhurried directness of a man who has walked into difficult rooms his entire life and has long since stopped being nervous about it. He pushed through the swinging door without a word. Sarah stood at the counter. The plate was still in her hands. She set it down carefully, the way you set something down when you do not know yet what it is, but you know it requires care. From behind the kitchen door, she heard nothing for a long moment. Then she heard a sound that was not quite a voice and not quite a collision, but somewhere between them, a short, abrupt sound that communicated a transfer of physical authority. Then silence. Then Rex Callahan came back through the door. He walked to the counter. He reached into his jacket and put two $50 bills on the formica, and he said, without sitting down, food was good. Sorry for the trouble. Sarah looked at the money, then at him. You cannot leave, she said. He looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who has not heard you, but the quiet of a man who has heard you and is deciding how much of the truth to give back. I have been leaving places my whole life, he said. She did not flinch. She said, if you leave tonight by morning, they will come here and ask me where you went, and I will not have an answer good enough to survive the question. The words sat in the air between them. Edna had set down her receipts. Rex Callahan looked at the woman across the counter from him. 48 years old, he would later understand, though he did not know her age then. She had dark hair with gray starting at the temples, pulled back without fuss. Her face was the face of a woman who had been through enough to know the difference between fear and clarity, and who was currently standing in clarity. Her eyes were blue-gray and direct, and they did not ask him for anything. They were simply stating the situation as it existed. How long, he said. 3 years, she said. Once a month, sometimes more. He looked at her hands on the counter. Steady. He sat back down. Sarah Briggs had worked at Rosie's Diner for 11 years, and before that she had worked at a hardware store in Elko for 4 years. And before that she had worked at a gas station on the edge of town for 2 years. And in all that time, she had been in the way that towns like this one produce women like her, quietly indispensable and publicly invisible. She knew everyone's order before they ordered it. She knew which ranchers were in debt and which ones were pretending not to be. She knew when a marriage was ending by the way a man's coffee consumption changed. She had learned to know things the way people learn to know things when nobody's watching them, carefully and completely, and without announcement. She had known about Vincent Morrow for 3 years. The first time had been an accident. She had been clearing a corner booth at 11 on a Friday night, the last booth before the back hall, and 2 men had been sitting there for 2 hours over coffee. They had stopped drinking at the 1-hour mark. She had not been listening exactly. She had been wiping down the adjacent table, and her mind had been elsewhere on the rent check she had sent 3 days ago and was not sure had cleared on the conversation she had had with her landlord that morning. And then a number had cut through the ambient noise of her own thoughts. A number and a name, a bank routing number, and the name of a shell company that she recognized because she had seen it on a receipt 3 weeks earlier on a supply invoice that had come through the wrong envelope opened by mistake. She had finished wiping the table and walked to the back and written both things down on the inside of her left forearm with a ballpoint pen, and washed it off in the bathroom sink once she had transferred it to paper. 3 weeks later, she had typed it all up and walked into the Elko County Sheriff's Office on a Tuesday morning and asked to speak to someone about financial misconduct. The deputy who took her statement had been polite. He had written things down. He had told her they would look into it. 48 hours later, a man she had never seen before had come into the diner on a Wednesday night and sat at the counter and ordered apple pie and looked at her for the duration of his meal with the steady, patient attention of a man who wants you to understand something without having to say it. He left a 20 on the counter. On the back of it in ballpoint were her home address, her car's license plate number, and the words "next time." That was 3 years ago. She had not reported anything since, but she had not forgotten what she knew either. She refilled Rex's coffee and she stood at the counter while he drank it, and she told him none of this yet because it was not the right moment, and she had learned to wait for right moments, the way you learn to wait for anything when waiting is the only leverage you have. She said instead, "His name is Vincent Morrow." Rex set his cup down. She watched something move through his expression. Not surprise. It was more like the look of a man who has been carrying a particular piece of information at a distance and has just been handed it up close. "You know that name," she said. "I know it," he said. "From when you were." He looked at her. "How do you know what I was?" She nodded at his vest, the patch on the left chest panel, the one she had been reading since he walked in the door. She had grown up in this county. She knew what patches meant. She knew what the particular configuration of symbols on his vest had meant once, and she knew what it meant that he was riding alone, what it meant that the patch was there but the energy around it had changed quieter somehow, like a radio turned to static. He said, "I rode with them for 28 years, have not been active in 3. "Why 3 years?" she said. He was quiet. Then he said, "Because 3 years ago I saw something that made me understand I was done." She did not push it. She recognized the shape of that sentence. It was the shape of a sentence that contained a thing a person had decided not to carry out loud anymore. She said, "Morrow has been running money through 4 garages in the northern part of the county. Has been for at least 5 years. I know the routing numbers. I know 2 of the company names. I reported it once and the report went straight to his desk." Rex looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Carl's going to wake up tomorrow morning and tell someone what happened here tonight. And by noon, Morrow is going to know you were in this diner. And by tonight, he is going to want to know why you are still breathing." She paused. Let him sit with that. And when he asks, she said, "I am the only person who can answer the question." From the far end of the counter, Edna Walsh finally spoke. She did not look up from her papers. She said in the flat conversational tone of a woman relaying information about weather, "His name was on 3 of those invoices. I kept copies." Both of them looked at her. She kept her eyes on her papers. 41 years, she said. "This diner has been on this road for 41 years. I knew what Vincent Morrow was doing inside of 6 months. I kept quiet because quiet kept us open." She smoothed a receipt with 2 fingers. "I am 79 years old, and I have reached the age at which keeping quiet no longer feels like wisdom." Rex looked at the old woman for a moment. Then he looked at the kitchen door. Then at the plate of food still sitting on the counter untouched. He said, "Where is Carl now?" "Zip-tied to the pipe under the prep sink," Sarah said. "I heard it. I know that sound." Rex nodded once. He said, "How long before someone comes looking?" Sarah looked at the clock on the wall. It was 2:41. Carl's shift ended at 4. Someone would come by around 4:30 if he did not check in. They had a window. 2 hours, she said. Rex pulled the untouched plate toward himself, looked at it once, and pushed it to the side. He put both hands flat on the counter. He was looking at the parking lot again. Sarah watched him think. She had spent 11 years reading people across this counter, and she could tell the difference between a man deciding whether to help and a man deciding how. He had passed the first decision sometime in the last 5 minutes. He was on the second now. She went to the back and untied her apron and hung it on the hook behind the register and went to the small room off the back hall where she kept her coat and her bag and the things she kept ready because she had kept them ready for 3 years, understanding on some level that there would be a night when ready would matter. She came back to the counter with her coat on. Edna was already standing, her own coat over her arm, her purse in her hand, the copies of the invoices folded into a white envelope tucked under her arm, as naturally as if she had been holding it for years, which in a way she had. Rex looked at the two of them. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man adjusting to a situation that had proven to contain more variables than initially presented. He said, "We are taking your truck." Edna said, "I assumed." They went out the back. The Nevada night was cold in the way November nights in the high desert are cold. Not wet, not soft, just a clean, hard cold that found every gap in your clothing and stated its position without apology. The sky was enormous and dark and absolutely full of stars. Sarah's breath came out in small clouds. She could hear the highway distant, a low continuous sound like a river. Edna's truck was a 1998 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked if you turned it to maximum and waited 8 minutes. Sarah had driven it twice when her own car was in the shop. She knew it started slow in the cold. Rex walked to it without asking which one it was. He held the passenger door for Edna and waited while the old woman climbed in with the careful dignity of someone who will accept no assistance but will not refuse a door held open. Then he went to the driver's side. Sarah got in the back. The engine turned over slow, caught, settled into a rough idle. Rex sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. He looked at the mirror and found Sarah's eyes in it. "You understand that this does not resolve tonight," he said. "I have understood that for 3 years," she said. He nodded, pulled out of the lot. The gravel crunched under the tires, and then they were on pavement, and the diner fell away behind them, its single window, light going small in the side mirror, until it was just a warm yellow point in the dark, and then nothing. They had been driving for 20 minutes in silence when Rex said, "You and Carol, you grew up here." Sarah looked at the back of his head, the way he said her sister's name, not like a question, like someone reclaiming something that had been stored a long way away. "Elko," she said, "both of us." Carol was 6 years older. He kept his eyes on the road. "She worked at the diner before me," Sarah said. "Edna gave her a job when she was 19. From the passenger seat, Edna spoke quietly. "Your sister used to stand at that window on slow nights and watch the highway. She said someday someone worth watching for would come down that road. I thought she was being romantic. She said it without looking away from the road ahead. She was being practical." Rex said nothing. His hands were steady on the wheel, but something had shifted in the set of his shoulders, something small and private. The adjustment of a man receiving information he has been keeping a space open for without admitting it. "She made me promise," Sarah said. "Before she died, she made me promise that if things got bad enough, I would look for you." The truck was quiet except for the heater working and the road under the tires. "She told me you would be hard to find," Sarah said. "She said you lived on the road and you did not stay anywhere long. She said Route 93 in Nevada in the fall was where you always ended up." Rex exhaled. A slow, controlled exhale, the kind that does the work that other people do with words. "She wrote your name on a piece of paper," Sarah said. "Rex Callahan." She folded it inside an envelope with some other things and she gave it to me and she said, "Take this and keep it. She said someday you might need it." She paused. "I kept it for 3 years," she said. "I thought I was handling things." He did not respond to that. "She said she told me you were mean-looking. She said do not let that stop you." From the passenger seat, Edna made a sound that in another moment might have been a laugh. Rex said she was not wrong about the mean-looking part. "No," Sarah said. She was not. The road unreeled ahead of them in the headlights, 2 lanes through the high desert, nothing on either side for as far as anyone could see. A jackrabbit crossed 20 feet ahead and was gone. The stars were everywhere. Sarah looked out the window. Thought about Carol the last time she had seen her in the hospital room in Elko in February. The window gray with winter light. Carol's hand thin in hers. Carol saying things with the careful deliberateness of someone who has organized what they need to say and is getting through the list. She had gotten to Rex Callahan near the end of the list. She had said his name once and then looked at Sarah and said, "If it ever gets to where you cannot handle it alone." She had not finished the sentence. She had not needed to. Sarah had spent 3 years believing she could handle it alone. She looked at the back of Rex's head, at the gray at his temples, at the way his hands rested on the wheel loose, but ready, the hands of a man who had been driving long enough that driving had stopped being something he did and become something he simply was. She thought about the photograph on the diner wall, about the way his face had changed when he looked at it. Not dramatically, not the way faces change in the movies. Just a small, quiet change, like a door opening onto something he thought was locked. She said she told me something else. He waited. She said you always did the right thing, eventually, Sarah said. She said it just sometimes took you a while to figure out what it was. The truck moved through the Nevada night. The heater had warmed to full now, pushing dry heat through the cab. Edna's hands were folded in her lap, her eyes on the road ahead, her white hair silver in the dashboard light. Rex Callahan drove and said nothing for a long mile. Then he said she always did know things a person would not expect. Yes, Sarah said, she did. She looked back out of the window. The diner was 40 miles behind them now. Carl was zip-tied to a pipe. Vincent Morrow did not know yet that the night had gone wrong. The window was closing, but it was still open. She thought about 3 years of once-a-month visits and $20 bills with addresses written on the back. She thought about the report that had gone straight to Morrow's desk. She thought about the number she had written on her forearm and transferred to paper and kept in a drawer in a room that a man had stood outside of. Once just stood there on the sidewalk in the morning, not doing anything, just making sure she understood what doing something would cost. She thought about all of it, sitting in the back of a 27-year-old truck, heading north through the dark with an old woman holding an envelope of invoices and a man she had met 2 hours ago who had known her sister's laugh. She had waited 3 years for the right moment. She was not certain this was the right moment, but she was increasingly certain it was the only one she was going to get. And so she did what Carol had told her to do, and she trusted it, and she watched the dark go by outside the window, and she let the truck carry them forward into whatever was waiting on the other side of the night. They drove through the rest of the dark without stopping. Rex took them north on 93 until the Nevada border faded behind them, and Idaho opened up ahead, flat and cold and enormous, under a sky that was just beginning to think about gray at the eastern edge. He drove the way he did everything, without waste, without commentary, eyes moving between the road and the mirrors, in a rhythm so consistent it had become unconscious. Sarah watched the mirrors too from the back seat. She had started doing it somewhere around the 40-mile mark and had not stopped. Edna slept. She had announced this intention at approximately 3:15 by closing her eyes and folding her hands in her lap, and within 4 minutes she had been asleep with the completeness of someone who has mastered the art of rest as a practical discipline. The envelope of invoices was still tucked under her arm. Sarah did not sleep. She watched the highway and thought about Carl waking up, thought about the angle of the pipe he was tied to, whether it would hold until 4, whether someone would come earlier. Thought about Morrow's people finding the diner empty and the kitchen disturbed, and working backward from those facts to conclusions she could not afford to be wrong about. At a gas station outside Twin Falls, Rex pulled in and filled the tank with cash and came back with 2 coffees and a bottle of water and a package of crackers that he handed to the back seat. Sarah took them. The coffee was bad and hot, and she drank half of it before they had cleared the station lot. She said, "How do you know him, Morrow?" Rex kept his eyes on the road. 5 years ago, he said, my chapter did a short arrangement with some people who moved equipment through his garages. I did not know his name at the time. I knew the setup. I pulled out of it inside of 3 months when I understood what the money was attached to. What was it attached to, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The short version, he said, is that Morrow had an arrangement with the county sheriff's office. Not just looking the other way. Active participation. There was a family 3 years before I got involved that lost a man on the highway. Accident that was not an accident. The investigation was closed inside of a week. The money that should have been in an insurance account for the wife and 2 kids got redirected through one of Morrow's shell companies. I found out about the family when I was already 3 months in. I got out and made sure the arrangement ended for my chapter. Morrow had been planning to expand it. He stopped talking. The highway moved under them. She said, "What did you do about the family?" He said, "I made sure they got what they were owed. I will not go into how." She believed him. She did not ask how. She said, and Morrow has been carrying that since. He said, men like Morrow do not let things go. They put them on a shelf. They wait until the timing feels right. She looked out the window. The Idaho landscape was coming up pale and flat in the early light, sage and rock and the distant suggestion of hills. She thought about timing, about a man who had been on a shelf for 3 years waiting to come down. She said Carl worked for him directly. He was not a regular employee. No, Rex said. He was placed. She thought about that, about 11 years of watching Carl through the kitchen window, and never once feeling the thing she should have felt, the thing that would have told her he was something other than what he appeared to be. She felt briefly the particular anger of a person who has been careful and still been exposed. She said, I have been careful for 3 years. I know, Rex said. She said, I watched everything. I kept my head down. I did not report anything after the first time. I know, he said again. She said, and it did not matter. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, it rarely does. Keeping quiet keeps you alive in the short term. It does not make the problem smaller. It just moves the timeline. She looked at the back of his head. The gray at the temples caught the early light. She said, Carol told me you were honest. She said sometimes it was inconvenient, but it was consistent. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She said, I think that was a compliment. He said, I think it probably was. They drove. The sun came up in pieces, first a line of pale gold along the eastern ridge, then a widening, then light that fell across the sage flats and long horizontal plains and turned everything it touched a color that had no name. Exactly, not quite gold and not quite copper, the color of the high desert in early morning in November, which is a color you have to see to understand, and which people who have seen it do not forget. Edna woke at 6:47 with the same completeness with which she had fallen asleep. She looked at the road ahead. She said, there is a town about 12 miles up. Pull off there. I need a bathroom and something to eat that is not crackers. Rex pulled off. They ate at a counter in a place with 4 stools and a woman behind it who looked like she had been there since the building was constructed and had no plans to leave before it came down. The food was eggs and toast and more bad coffee, and it was exactly what all 3 of them needed. Nobody talked much. Edna ate with the appetite of someone who has decided that comfort is a non-negotiable operating expense. Rex ate fast and kept his eyes on the window. Sarah ate half her eggs and then sat with her hands around her coffee cup and thought. It was in the truck when they were back on the road that Rex found Carl's phone. He had taken it from Carl's apron pocket before they left, and he had left it off, and he pulled it out now and turned it on and held it on the wheel while it loaded. He went through it without comment, his face neutral, and then he handed it back to Sarah. She looked at the screen. There were photographs, 7 of them. Sarah at the counter, Sarah in the parking lot getting out of her car, Sarah walking the 2 blocks from her rented room to the diner on the early shift, Sarah at the grocery store in town. The timestamps went back 4 months. Beneath the photographs, there was a file. She opened it. It was a scan. She recognized the formatting before she recognized the content. Then she recognized the content. It was her report, the one she had filed 3 years ago, the one the deputy had taken down politely and told her they would look into. Her words typed up on the county form with her signature at the bottom. Across the top, stamped in red ink, was a single word, unsubstantiated, and in the corner, a fax header. The date was 2 days after she had filed it. The destination number was not the county attorney's office. She did not recognize the number, but she understood what it meant. She looked at it for a long time. She said they had this the whole time. Rex said yes. She said they were not watching me because I might report again. They were watching me because I already had. He said you wrote down specific numbers, specific names. Even if they killed the report, you still existed as a person who knew those things. She set the phone down on the seat beside her. She thought about 3 years of keeping her head down, 3 years of not making waves, not drawing attention, working her shifts and paying her rent, and telling herself that quiet was safety. 3 years of a man standing on the sidewalk outside her building, just once, just to make sure she remembered the cost. She thought about Carol's envelope, Carol writing down a name on a piece of paper and folding it away for the day when quiet stopped being enough. She said my sister knew. Rex said nothing. She said she knew it would come to this eventually. She knew I could not just outlast it, Edna said from the passenger seat. Carol was the kind of woman who looked at a situation and saw where it was going, not where it was. She paused. She used to say that patience without a plan is just waiting. She said it the way she said things that were simply true and did not require elaboration. Rex drove. His jaw was set. Sarah had the impression of a man doing the particular arithmetic of a situation that has more variables than he would prefer running the numbers without showing the work. She said, "What are you thinking?" He said, I am thinking we need somewhere to land for a day, somewhere Morrow's people will not expect. And I am thinking I know someone in Idaho who owes me a conversation. She said, who? He said, Hank Donovan. He rode with me for 11 years. I made him vice president of the chapter in 2015. He has been running things in the Boise area since I stepped down. She said, you trust him. He said, I trusted him 3 years ago. She noticed what he did not say. She filed it. He made a call on his own phone, a number he dialed from memory. It rang 4 times. A voice answered, male, rough at the edges, the kind of voice that has been strained by weather and years, and the particular demands of a life lived at volume. Rex's voice stayed level and brief. He gave nothing away. He asked for a meeting point and a place to rest and said he would explain when he got there. Hank Donovan said to come to an address in a town 20 miles south of Boise. He said it was safe. He said he would have the back room ready. Rex thanked him and hung up. They drove for another hour. The Idaho landscape changed as they moved north, the flat sage country, giving way to something with more elevation, more structure, the horizon pulling up into actual hills. The sky was fully light now, pale blue and enormous. Sarah watched the mirror. At the 50-mile mark, she saw the vehicle. Silver, 4-door, sitting in the right lane 200 yards back, maintaining distance. She said, there is a silver car behind us. Rex checked the mirror. His expression did not change. She said, it has been there for a while. He said, I know, since the gas station. She said, and you did not say anything. He said, I wanted to see what it did. She said, what has it done? He said nothing, which is either good or bad. She watched it, kept her eyes on it the way she had learned to watch things quietly without looking like she was watching. The silver car maintained its distance with a precision that was not the precision of a car driven by someone with somewhere to be. She said, there is a yellow sticker on the back bumper. Left side. He looked in the mirror. She said, I saw that car in the diner parking lot 2 nights ago, Tuesday late. It parked at the far end and sat for 20 minutes and left. Rex said, you are sure? She said, I remember plates. I've been doing it for 3 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that is not a coincidence. No, she said. He said, you have a good memory. She said, I have a survival memory. There is a difference. The silver car held its distance for another 10 miles. Then at a junction where Route 93 crossed a county road, it fell back and took the turn east and was gone. Rex watched it go in the mirror. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, they know where we are going. She looked at the back of his head. He said, Hank picked up on the second ring. Hank never picks up on the second ring. Sarah was quiet. He said, someone told them we would be on this road. Someone who knew I would call Hank. She said, is that possible? He said, 3 years ago it was not. He paused. I do not know what 3 years looks like from the inside of Morrow's wallet. He did not say Hank's name again. He did not need to. He took the next exit without signaling and turned south on a county road that ran through farmland, a road with no markings and no traffic, and fence posts running along the shoulder in both directions. He drove for 4 miles and then pulled onto a dirt track behind a grain storage building and stopped the engine. The silence was immediate and total. Just wind moving across the flat land. Just the engine ticking as it cooled. Edna looked out the windshield. She said, this is not Boise. Rex said, no, we are not going to Boise. He sat with his hands on the wheel. Sarah could see his face in the mirror, not turned toward her, but visible in the rectangular frame of glass. He was doing the arithmetic again. She recognized the look. She had been doing it herself for 3 years. He said, I have to ask you something. She said, ask. He said, the report you filed. You said specific numbers, specific names. Do you have documentation, files, copies, photographs? She was quiet for a moment. He looked at her in the mirror. She said, I have what is in my head. He said, that is not. She said, let me finish. He waited. She said, I wrote that report from memory. I did not have files. I did not have photographs. What I had were 2 numbers I had memorized off an invoice I had opened by accident, and 1 company name I had heard through the wall of a corner booth on a Friday night. I wrote what I knew. I signed my name to it. She paused. She said, but I have had 3 years since then. 3 years of Morrow's people coming through that diner once a month. 3 years of orders and conversations and men who think a waitress is furniture. She let that sit. She said, furniture hears everything. Rex turned and looked at her directly for the first time since they had pulled off the road. His pale gray eyes were level. She said, I know 6 company names now. I know 3 routing numbers. I know the name of the county official who signed the redirect on the insurance account for that family you mentioned, because 2 of Morrow's people argued about it in the third booth on a Thursday evening 8 months ago, and one of them said the name twice. I have dates, I have amounts, I have a pattern. She said I do not have a single piece of paper. I have never written any of it down because paper can be found. It is all here. She touched her temple with 2 fingers. The wind moved against the side of the truck. Edna was looking at her. Rex was looking at her. She said, my sister told me you always figured out what the right thing was eventually. She said it just took you a while. She paused. I figure we are both in that position right now. Rex held her gaze for another 3 seconds. Then he turned back to face the windshield. He said, I know a man named Dale Hutchins. He is a reporter out of Reno, covers Nevada state politics and county-level corruption. He wrote 2 pieces on Morrow 4 years ago, could not get them published. Not enough direct evidence to get past a legal review. He reached into his jacket. He had a phone there, a second one older, a prepaid, the kind you buy at a gas station and use twice. He held it for a moment. He said, if you can give Hutchins what you just told me, with the level of specificity you just showed me, he has enough to go back to his editor. With the routing numbers, he can get a forensic accountant to pull the thread. With the official's name, he can cross-reference the public record. She said, and that is enough. He said it is enough to start a fire. Whether the fire catches depends on where it spreads. She said, will he protect me as a source? Rex said yes, because I will ask him to, and because he has been waiting 4 years to publish this story, and he is not going to burn the person who hands it to him. She looked out the window at the empty farmland, at the fence posts running away into the distance, at the flat November sky. She said, and Morrow. Rex said we handle that separately. She said, how? He said the way things get handled when the legal route has already been poisoned. Not violently. He said it carefully, like a man who understands the weight of the word and wants it placed correctly. Not violently, but with enough presence that the math stops making sense for him. She understood what he meant. She had lived in this county long enough to understand what presence meant when it arrived in sufficient numbers on motorcycles. She said you would do that. He looked at her in the mirror again. He said, your sister sent you to find me. He paused. That means something. The truck was quiet. Edna was looking at the grain storage building through the windshield with the expression of a woman who is calculating whether the structure is sound. Sarah thought about Carol at 32. Sitting in a room she was already beginning to understand she would not be leaving, making her list of the things that needed to be arranged. Writing a name on a piece of paper, folding it into an envelope, handing it to her younger sister with the instruction that had sounded at the time more like optimism than practicality. If it ever gets to where you cannot handle it alone. She thought about 3 years. She thought about this moment sitting in a truck behind a grain storage building in southern Idaho with a 79-year-old woman holding an envelope and a man who had known Carol's voice before Sarah knew what kind of woman she herself was going to become. She thought about the silver car with the yellow sticker on the bumper. She said there is something else, something I did not tell anyone because I did not know if I had misread it. But I have had 3 years to decide. Rex waited. She said the family, the one you mentioned, the wife and 2 kids. He said, what about them? She said there was a name in the invoices. On the redirect documents, one of Morrow's men said it in the diner. It was not the county official's name. It was the insurance adjuster. The person who filed the redirect paperwork. She paused. She said his name is Gerald Briggs. He is my father's brother, my uncle. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a piece of information landing in a space that was not ready for it. Rex turned around again. Fully this time. She held his look. She said, I did not know until 18 months ago. One of Morrow's men said the name in the third booth, and I went home that night and I sat with it until 3 in the morning. Gerald Briggs. I have an uncle named Gerald. He left the county before I was 10. My mother never talked about him. She said he had gone bad. She said, I do not know if he is still involved. I do not know what Hutchins can do with it. But I know it is true, and I know I cannot be the one who decides not to say it. Edna was very still. Rex said that is a hard thing to carry. Sarah said, yes, it is. He said, you are sure you want it to be part of this? She said, if it is true, it is part of this whether I want it to be or not. He held her gaze for a long moment. She did not look away. She had not looked away from difficult things for a long time, and she was not going to start now. Not in a truck in southern Idaho with the road ahead of her and the thing that needed doing not yet done. He turned back to the windshield. He said, all right, he started the truck. He pulled off the dirt track and back onto the county road and turned north toward a different route, one that avoided Boise and Hank Donovan and the silver car with the yellow sticker. And he drove without speaking. And Sarah watched the mirror, and Edna held the envelope. And the November light lay across the Idaho farmland in long, cold plains that lit everything they touched without warming anything at all. They found a motel outside Twin Falls at 11 in the morning. Cash. Rex signed as Jim Walker. The room had 2 beds and a heater that worked, and a window that faced the parking lot, which Rex positioned a chair in front of before he did anything else. He sat in the chair. He made 2 calls on the prepaid phone, both brief, both without names. The second call was to Dale Hutchins. Sarah heard one side of the conversation. She heard Rex say, I have a source, I have routing numbers, company names, an official's identity, and a direct connection to the family case from 4 years ago. She is credible, she is consistent, and she has been sitting on this for 3 years, because the first time she reported it, the report landed on Morrow's desk inside 48 hours. A pause. Rex said she is a waitress at a diner on Route 93. She is also the smartest person in this situation, and I am including myself. Another pause. Rex said tomorrow, Twin Falls area. I will send the address. He hung up. He looked at Sarah. She was sitting on the edge of the bed nearest the window with her coat still on and her hands in her lap. She looked like what she was, a woman at the end of a long night who was also at the beginning of something that was going to require more from her before it gave anything back. He said tomorrow afternoon he wants to meet in person. She said, I know. He said, you do not have to do this the way it sounds like you are thinking about doing it. She said, what way is that? He said, like it is your responsibility to fix everything that went wrong. She looked at him. He said, you reported it once. You got punished for it. That was not your failure. That was a system that had already been bought. You do not owe anyone the rest of yourself. She was quiet for a moment. The heater kicked on, filling the room with dry warmth. She said, Carol told me something the last time I saw her. She said I had spent too much of my life deciding that things were too big for me to touch. She said I kept myself small because small felt safe, and that one day I was going to have to decide if small was actually what I wanted to be. She paused. She said, I have been deciding that for 3 years. She looked at him across the room. The morning light came through the gap in the curtains and fell across the floor between them. She said, I am not doing this because I think I owe it to anyone. I am doing it because I have been carrying it for 3 years, and I am done carrying it quietly. I want to put it down somewhere it can do some good. Rex looked at her for a long moment. The pale gray eyes. The face of a man who has known for a long time the difference between someone saying something and someone meaning it. He said, all right. He turned back to the window. Edna had stretched out on the second bed with her shoes still on and was reading the invoices with her glasses on and making small sounds of confirmation, as if the numbers were telling her things she had suspected and was now having verified. Sarah lay back on her bed with her coat still on and looked at the ceiling. She thought about Carol. She thought about an envelope kept in a drawer for 3 years. She thought about a name written on a piece of paper folded carefully, given without ceremony, with the particular trust of a person who has looked at everything they have to offer and decided that a name is the most solid thing. She thought about 11 years of watching a kitchen window. She thought about tomorrow. Outside, the November light moved across Twin Falls, and the wind came down off the southern Idaho hills and moved through the parking lot and pressed against the motel window, and then moved on, heading north toward whatever was waiting up there in the cold country ahead. She slept 4 hours and woke before Rex did. The room was gray with early light coming through the gap in the curtains, and the heater had cycled down to a low murmur, and Edna was breathing steadily in the other bed, with the invoices still fanned across the blanket beside her like she had fallen asleep mid-audit. Sarah lay still for a moment and listened to the parking lot. Wind, a truck passing on the highway 2 blocks over. Nothing that did not belong. She got up quietly and went to the bathroom and ran cold water over her face and looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. She had not looked at herself carefully in a long time. Not the way you look when you are actually seeing and not just checking. She looked now. The gray at her temples had been there for 2 years. The lines around her eyes were the lines of someone who had spent a decade squinting into diner light and parking lot dark in the particular strain of watching for things she hoped would not come. She looked like what she was, a woman who had been careful for a long time, a woman who was done being only that. She dried her face and went back to the room and sat in the chair by the window that Rex had vacated at some point in the early morning. He was on the floor against the wall beside the door, with his jacket over his chest and his eyes closed, and she understood this was not carelessness, but position, that he had moved from the chair to a place where he could be between the door and the room if the door came open wrong. She sat and watched the parking lot and thought about what she was going to say to Dale Hutchins. She had been organizing it in her head since before the motel, since the truck, since the county road behind the grain storage building. She had been running it the way she ran a busy Friday night shift, sequencing it, finding the order that made sense, knowing which thing had to come before which other thing and why. She had 6 company names, 3 routing numbers, 1 official, 1 adjuster, the dates of the corner booth conversations, the pattern of the monthly visits, the report that had been faxed to the wrong desk. She had the shape of it. She had the connective tissue. She had the memory of a woman who had spent 3 years treating survival as a form of record keeping. She thought about Gerald Briggs, her father's brother, a name she had not spoken out loud since the night she had sat with it until 3 in the morning and understood what it meant. She thought about saying it to Hutchins and what would happen after. She thought about her father, who had been dead for 12 years and who had never mentioned Gerald in her presence, except once briefly to say that some people go wrong early and stay that way. She thought about what it would mean to put Gerald Briggs into a published account of Vincent Morrow's operations in Elko County, Nevada. She thought about this family, the wife, the 2 kids, the insurance money that had been redirected through a shell company, while someone filed the paperwork and someone else signed it, and everyone involved had decided that the grief of people without power was an acceptable cost of doing business. She thought about that for a long time. Rex opened his eyes at 6:40. He did not move immediately. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the way of a person whose waking is not the transition from unconsciousness to consciousness, but simply the moment when consciousness acknowledges it has been running all along. Then he sat up and looked at her in the chair. She said, "I have been thinking about the sequence." He said, "Tell me." She told him the company names first because they were the structural frame, the routing numbers second because they gave Hutchins something to hand to a forensic accountant, the official's name third with the date and the specific conversation she had overheard, because that was the piece that connected Morrow to the county government directly. Then the adjuster, then Gerald. Rex listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You have the dates of the conversations." She said month and approximate week for most of them, exact date for 4 of them, because they happened on nights I remembered for other reasons. He said, "What other reasons?" She said, "One was the night my landlord told me he was selling the building. One was the night Edna told me she had been diagnosed with something she was not going to let stop her. One was the night I found out Carol's hospital bills were going to exceed what she had left in savings." She said it without self-pity, just facts placed in order. He said, "Hutchins will want to know why you remember the dates." She said, "I know. I will tell him." Edna woke at 7 and reorganized the invoices in the first 3 minutes of consciousness, and then stood and smoothed her coat and said she needed coffee and something that was not a motel vending machine, and that she assumed someone would make this happen. Rex drove them to a diner 2 miles from the motel. Different county, different road, the kind of place with a gravel lot and a screen door and a handwritten specials board that had not been updated since September. They sat in a back booth. They ate. Sarah drank 2 cups of coffee and ate all of her eggs this time, and felt the food settle something in her that had been unsettled since 2:17 in the morning, 2 days ago. Edna ate her toast and looked at the specials board and said, "Their pie is probably not as good as mine." Rex said probably not. Edna said definitely not. They were back at the motel by 8:30. Rex sent the address to Hutchins on the prepaid. Hutchins replied in 4 minutes with a single word: Kindly. He arrived at 1:15 in the afternoon in a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked windshield and a backseat full of files and a laptop bag that looked like it had been through several things it had not been designed for. He was 51 years old, lean and gray-stubbled, with the permanent, slightly distracted expression of a man whose attention is always partly somewhere else, parsing something cross-referencing. He shook Rex's hand and nodded at Edna and looked at Sarah for a moment with the careful, non-invasive attention of someone who has learned to assess credibility without making people feel assessed. He said, "Rex says you have been sitting on this for 3 years." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why now?" She said, "Because someone tried to kill the man sitting next to you 2 nights ago in my diner, and I was the only person in the building who saw it happening." Hutchins looked at Rex. Rex said the cook is still zip-tied to a pipe. Probably not anymore, but that is where we left him. Hutchins opened his laptop. Sarah talked for 2 hours and 19 minutes. She did not use notes. She did not hesitate on the numbers. She gave them in sequence the way she had organized them in the chair before dawn, and she gave them with the precision of someone who has been holding an information in a place where it could not be reached or altered or lost, which is to say in her own memory maintained through 3 years of deliberate and solitary repetition. Hutchins typed and occasionally stopped her to ask her to repeat a number or clarify a date or confirm a spelling. He did not express skepticism. He did not express enthusiasm. He had the professional stillness of a man who has been doing this long enough to know that his reaction to what he is hearing is not the relevant thing. When she got to Gerald Briggs, he stopped typing for a moment. He said, "Say that name again." She said it again. He looked at his screen. He typed something she could not see. He was quiet for 30 seconds. Then he said, "Gerald R. Briggs, insurance adjuster licensed in Nevada, formerly licensed in 3 other states. Currently listed as a principal in a holding company based in Henderson." He turned the screen toward her. She looked at it. She said, "That is him." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because my father had a photograph of the two of them when they were young. Gerald was 6 years older than my father. He had a particular way of standing weight on the left foot, right shoulder, slightly forward. The man in that company filing has the same registration address as a property my grandmother owned. I looked it up 8 months ago." Hutchins looked at the screen. He said he is listed as a principal alongside a man named Thomas Vance. Vance is connected to 3 of the shell companies in the earlier Morrow reporting. He is also the person who filed the closure paperwork on the insurance case involving the Mercer family in 2019. The room was quiet. Sarah said the family. Hutchins said Daniel Mercer, 34 years old. Highway accident, March 2019. Wife and 2 daughters. The insurance payout was redirected through a holding company, and the case was closed as settled. The family received $11,000. The policy was for $420,000. He said it the way journalists say things that make them angry, which is flatly without inflection, because inflection would compromise the precision, and the precision is the thing that matters. Sarah thought about the wife. She had not known her name until this moment. She had known the shape of the story, the outline of it, heard through a corner booth wall, but she had not known the name. Daniel Mercer, a wife, 2 daughters. She said, "I want the family to know what happened." Hutchins looked at her. She said, "When this publishes, I want there to be something in it that tells them it was not lost, that someone knew and that it took too long, but that it is being said now." Hutchins said, "I can do that." She said, "That is not optional for me." He said, "I understand, I can do that." He closed his laptop. He looked at Rex. He said, "I can have a draft to my editor inside 72 hours. With the routing numbers, I can get a forensic accountant on the phone today and have a preliminary confirmation by tomorrow morning." He paused. "I need to know if you are prepared for what happens when this publishes." He was looking at Sarah when he said it. She said, "I have been preparing for 3 years." He said, "Your name will be in it, as a source, as the person who came forward." She said, "I know." He said, "Morrow will know it is you." She said, "Morrow already knows it is me. He has known for 3 years. The only thing that changes is that everyone else will know too." Hutchins looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Rex. He said, "She is right." Rex said, "I know." Hutchins left at 3:40 in the afternoon. He shook Sarah's hand at the door and held it for a moment and said, "I am sorry it took this long." She said, "So am I." He nodded and got in the Subaru and drove north. Rex stood at the window and watched him go. Then he made one more call on the prepaid phone. Sarah listened from across the room. Hank picked up on the second ring. Rex said, "I know what you did." A long silence came through the phone. Then Hank's voice, lower than before, stripped of the ease it had carried that morning. He said, "He had my daughter's address, Rex. He had photographs. I did not have a choice." Rex said, "There is always a choice." He said it without anger, which was worse than anger. He said it the way you say something that is simply and finally true. "You made the wrong one." He hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Sarah watched him. He set it on the table and did not pick it up again. Then he took out the second prepaid and made the call he had been building toward since the grain storage building. She heard him say, "I need a showing, not a confrontation. A showing. Tomorrow, Elko County, Nevada. Morrow's main office on Commerce Street. I need bodies on bikes in the street visible. Not inside, not threatening. Just present." He listened. He said, "As many as can make it from Nevada and Idaho on short notice. I need it clean, no incidents. Just the road and the numbers." He hung up. He looked at Sarah. He said, "Tomorrow afternoon." When Hutchins makes his call to Morrow's office for comment, which he will do before he files, there will be something else happening simultaneously on Commerce Street. She said, "How many?" He said, "I do not know yet." "Whoever can make it." She said, "Is that enough?" He said, "Morrow is a man who understands what it means when the math changes. When the choice is between a story that is already going to print and a situation that generates more attention, most men in his position choose to let the story happen and deal with the aftermath rather than create additional exposure." He paused. He said, "The showing is not to stop him from doing something. It is to make sure he knows that doing something will be seen." She understood the distinction. That night was quiet in a way the previous nights had not been. The urgency had shifted. It had not disappeared, but it had changed shape, moved from the acute and immediate into something more like the last hour before a decision becomes final, the quiet of a thing already set in motion that is now simply proceeding at its own pace. Edna placed the invoices back in the envelope and folded the flap down with the satisfaction of a woman completing a task she has been waiting to complete for longer than the task itself has been visible. She said from the bed, "I want to be in the diner when the story publishes." Rex said, "We will get you back there." She said, "I have never been run out of my own place for more than a day." She said it not as a complaint, but as a statement of operating principle. "I am not going to make this the exception." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed. She said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Go ahead." She said, 3 years ago, when you left the chapter, you said it was because you saw something." She paused. "You do not have to tell me what it was." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window. He said, "There was a man in my chapter. Good writer, 20 years, and the kind of person who knows how to be useful in a way that makes you trust him before you have decided to. He had a daughter, 16 years old. She got into a situation that was connected to some of the operations we were running. Not directly, but connected. And I found out about it 6 weeks after it happened, and I understood that I had built something that had become large enough to have consequences I could no longer track." He stopped. He said she was all right eventually, but all right eventually is not the same as all right. He looked at the window. He said, "I decided that a thing which had grown past my ability to be responsible for it was a thing I needed to stop being part of." He paused. "Carol would have told you that I came to that conclusion approximately 8 years after I should have." Sarah said she would have been right. He said, "Yes." She said, "But you came to it." He said, "Eventually." She said, "She told me that it was consistent with you." He looked at her. She said you were the kind of person who always got there. The arriving was never in question. Just the timeline." He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he said, "She was generous with me. More than I earned." Sarah said she was generous with people she loved. She was not generous with people she did not. He looked at her. She said she did not spend her generosity casually. Edna said from beneath the blanket, "I am going to sleep now. I suggest you both do the same." Neither of them argued with her. The next morning they drove back to Nevada. Rex drove. Sarah watched the mirror. Edna held the envelope in her lap and looked at the landscape with the expression of someone who has been away from their land and is measuring the distance home in a unit more personal than miles. They crossed back into Nevada at 11:40. The high desert opened up around them, sage and rock, and the particular quality of Nevada light, which is harder and cleaner than Idaho light, less forgiving, more honest. Sarah felt something settle in her chest that she recognized after a moment as familiarity. This was her country. She had grown up inside it. She had stayed when others left. She had kept her head down in her shifts and her knowledge and her silence for 3 years inside this light, and she was coming back to it now, with all of those things still in her possession and the silence finally at an end. Hutchins had called Morrow's office that morning at 11 while they were still 2 hours outside Elko. Rex had been expecting it. He had said on the phone with Hutchins the night before, make the call. Let him know it is coming. Give him 2 hours. Hutchins had said, understood. He had called at 11, identified himself, asked for comment on a story about Shell company operations in Elko County connecting to the Mercer family insurance case. Morrow's office had said no comment. The door was now closed, and the story was going to press regardless. They reached Commerce Street in Elko at 2:14 in the afternoon. Rex parked the truck on the north end of the block, and they sat for a moment. The street was ordinary. A row of low commercial buildings, a hardware store, an insurance office, a vacant storefront with paper in the windows. Morrow's business office was mid-block unmarked, except for a suite number on the door. Then Sarah heard it. She heard it before she saw it. The sound of engines, multiple coming from the south, a sound that built on itself as it approached, low and layered and significant, in the way that sound is significant when it is made by many things moving together with intention. They came around the corner from the south end of Commerce Street in a column. 53 motorcycles. She counted them as they came. She was a person who counted things, who had always counted things, and she counted them now. 1 through 53 as they filed onto Commerce Street and parked in a line along the curb that stretched from the south end of the block to within 30 feet of Morrow's office door. 53 men in leather, some older, some younger, all of them with the particular stillness of people who have been asked to be present and are being present completely without drama, without noise beyond the engines that were now going quiet one by one as each bike was shut down. The street did not stop. Cars still moved through, people still walked, but they slowed. They noticed. A thing was happening on Commerce Street that was legible in its own language, a language that did not require translation. Rex got out of the truck. He walked to the man at the front of the column, a broad man in his late 50s with a gray beard and an expression of deep patience. They shook hands. They spoke briefly and quietly. The broad man nodded. Rex walked back to the truck. He opened Sarah's door. He said Hutchins called 40 minutes ago. Morrow's office said no comment and hung up. The story is going to press tonight. She got out. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the line of motorcycles along the curb and the men sitting on them or standing beside them, 53 of them facing the street, all of them simply there, present, visible. 53 people who had ridden to a street in Elko, Nevada on a Thursday afternoon to stand as witnesses to a thing that needed witnessing. Morrow's office door did not open. They stood for 1 hour on Commerce Street. At the end of the hour, Rex spoke again briefly to the broad man with the gray beard, and the column started their engines one by one and pulled out in the same order they had arrived, a long, slow procession that turned north at the end of the block and was gradually absorbed by the ordinary sound of a Nevada afternoon. Sarah watched them go. She stood on the sidewalk of Commerce Street in the town where she had lived her whole life and watched 53 motorcycles carry themselves away around a corner, and she felt something shift inside her that was not dramatic and not simple, and that she understood was going to take time to fully name. Rex stood beside her. She said, will it hold? He said, for now it will hold. Morrow is a man who needs the math to make sense, and right now the math says that anything he does increases his exposure at the exact moment his exposure is already at maximum. For now means we watch. It does not mean we stop watching. She said, I know how to watch. He said, I know you do. The article published 11 days later. Nevada Independent front page of the digital edition, 6,000 words. A forensic accountant's confirmation of the routing structures. The official's name, the Shell companies, the Mercer family case, Gerald R. Briggs as a named principal in the redirect scheme. And at the end of the article, in the fourth to last paragraph, A paragraph that Dale Hutchins had written and rewritten until he got it to where it needed to be, a statement that the Mercer family, Patricia Mercer and her daughters, now aged 13 and 15, had been contacted, and that Mrs. Mercer had said, "I always knew it was not right. I just did not know anyone else knew too." Sarah read that paragraph 3 times. Vincent Morrow was arrested on a Thursday morning, 14 days after the article published. The county sheriff, who had been his instrument for 11 years, resigned the same afternoon. Gerald Briggs was named in a federal civil complaint 6 weeks later. He did not contest it. Sarah was in the diner when she heard about the arrest. She was filling a cup for a rancher she had known for 9 years, and her phone buzzed on the counter, and she looked at the screen and read the notification and set the coffee pot down and stood still for a moment with both hands flat on the formica. The rancher said, "You all right?" She said yes. She said it, and she meant it in a way she had not meant it when asked for 3 years. Edna was at the far end of the counter going through the invoice folder one final time, not because the numbers had changed, but because she had decided the folder deserved a proper closing. She looked up. She looked at Sarah's face. She understood the way Edna understood things, which was completely and without requiring explanation, and she said nothing, which was the right thing. Sarah picked up the coffee pot. She finished her shift. 3 days later, Rex came back. She had not known he was coming. She had not asked after Commerce Street when he was leaving, or where he was going, or whether she would hear from him again. She had understood that he was a man for whom those questions were complicated in a way that had nothing to do with his intentions and everything to do with the length and particular shape of his history. She had let him leave without asking, and she had gone back to her work and her county and her understanding that some things resolve the way they resolve and not the way you might prefer. She was wiping down the counter at 8 in the morning when the motorcycle pulled into the lot. She heard it before she saw it. The same engine she had heard 11 days before the story published. Low and steady, the engine of a thing that had been running a long time. She watched him park, watched him sit for a moment, watched him hang the helmet on the handlebar and climb off with the same careful deliberateness, a body moving through the world at its own considered pace. He came through the door. He sat at the far end of the counter, back to the wall, eyes on the door. She filled his cup before he looked up. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it. She stood across the counter and said nothing for a moment. The diner was quiet. Edna was in the back. The morning light came through the plate glass window and fell across the counter in the particular way it fell in November, low and long and honest. He said, "I have been writing." She said, "I know." He said, "I went north, went up through Idaho again, then west." She waited. He said, "I have been thinking about what Carol said, that I never stayed anywhere long enough to understand why it was worth staying." She looked at him, the gray at his temples, the face that had been weathered by wind and decision, the pale gray eyes holding something she recognized because she had been holding a version of it herself for 3 years, the particular weight of a thing known and not yet spoken. She said, "Anne," he said, "I have been writing for 3 days trying to find a reason to keep going west, and I have not been able to." She held his gaze. He said, "I do not know what this looks like. I want to be honest about that. I do not know how to do the thing I am describing in the way it should be done. I have been on the road for most of my adult life, and I know how to leave places, and I do not have a lot of practice with the other thing." She said, "I am not asking you for the other thing." He looked at her. She said, "I am asking you to stay. That is a different thing. Staying is just a decision you make and then make again." She paused. "I have been making it about this county for 11 years. It is not as complicated as it sounds." He looked at the mug. He looked at the window, at the parking lot, at the hand-painted sign above the door. Rosie's, the letters faded to the color of old bones by 41 years of Nevada sun. He looked back at her. She said, "I need someone to fix the generator behind the kitchen. It trips every time we run the dishwasher and the fryer at the same time, and Carl is not coming back." He said, "I do not know anything about generators." She said, "I know, but I need someone who is going to be here while he figures it out." From the back, Edna's voice came through the pass-through window, unhurried, the tone of a woman relaying information of mild practical interest. She said, "There is a hardware store 4 blocks east. They open at 9. Rex looked toward the window, then back at Sarah. He said, "She has been listening this whole time." Sarah said, "She is always listening. You should know that by now." He put both hands flat on the counter. He looked at them for a moment. Then he picked up the coffee mug and drank. He did not get up. He did not reach for his jacket or his helmet or the practiced distance of a man who moves before the moment can ask too much of him. He sat at the far end of the counter in the November morning light, and he drank his coffee and he stayed. Sarah picked up the pot and filled his cup a second time. She went back to wiping down the counter. The morning light came through the plate glass the way it always had, falling across the Formica in long, honest plains. Outside, Route 93 ran north and south through the high desert. The diner sat beside it the way it had sat for 41 years. The coffee was strong. The door was open. That was enough.